Hello everybody, and welcome to Theology 101. Welcome to our Friday series where we are going over different pictures of faith from Hebrews chapter 11. Today we will look at the deathbed confessions of Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph to see their faith while they were facing death. Let's start by looking at Isaac. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. Now, what do we know about Isaac? We know that Isaac was a man of faith, but does faith usually express itself passively? In other words, Isaac was not a go-getter. Remember when Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac and he never fought back? Later, when it was time for Isaac to get married, Abraham sends a servant to find Isaac a wife. And after finding Rebekah, we see that Isaac just kind of goes with the flow. But there is one time where Isaac went against his passive nature, and that is when it came to his son Esau. When Jacob and Esau were born as twins, God gave a promise that the blessings given to Abraham will follow his younger son Jacob. However, Isaac preferred Esau because he was a man's man who could hunt, while Rebekah favored Jacob because he was a mama's boy who could cook. So we see a divide in the family, and this favoritism would affect Isaac. Because although he knew in his head that Jacob would be the one God will bless, he wanted to give that blessing to Esau. Fast forward to when Isaac is about to die. Isaac wants to bless his sons before his death, but notice whom he wants to bless. Remember, God already told Isaac that Jacob will be the one through whom the Abrahamic covenant blessings will go to. But Isaac, for the first time in his life, does not remain passive, and he decides to bless Esau instead. We see that Rebekah intervenes. She overhears what Isaac says and tells Jacob to pretend to be Esau to receive the blessing. So Jacob puts on animal fur on his arm because Esau is hairy, and he goes in and pretends to be Esau. Isaac can't see really well, and he's confused because he hears Jacob's voice, but he feels Esau's arms. Nevertheless, Isaac, thinking that Jacob is Esau, gives him the blessing that was given to him from Abraham. Then we see that Jacob gets exposed when Esau returns. But I want you to notice how Isaac responds when he found out he blessed the wrong son. Then Isaac trembled very violently and said, "Who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? And I ate it all before you came, and I have blessed him. Yes, and he shall be blessed." Even though he was angry, Isaac accepted the fact that Jacob was blessed instead of Esau. It is this response which the author of Hebrews wants to highlight. When God had providentially caused Isaac to bless the person he didn't want, he said, "And he shall be blessed." We see Isaac's full acceptance of Jacob as the promised son when he gives a second blessing to him. Now let's move on to Jacob. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. Now what do we know about Jacob? Jacob was very different from his father Isaac. He was not passive, but a go-getter. One night, Jacob wrestled with God, and he actually won. And that was when his name was changed to Israel, meaning the one who wrestles with God. When he wanted to marry Rachel, he actively worked for his uncle for 7 years. And when he was tricked into marrying Leah, Jacob worked for another 7 years. So Jacob doesn't accept his circumstances, but he fights for what he wants. Although Jacob was very different from his father, there was one thing that they shared: their faith in God's promises. On his deathbed, Jacob decides to bless Joseph's 2 sons while in Egypt. However, instead of doing the typical protocol of blessing the older son, Jacob switches his hands and decides to bless Joseph's younger son instead. Joseph tried to correct Jacob, but notice what Jacob says. But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." Why did Jacob do this? He was following the way God has blessed previous generations. God blessed Isaac instead of Ishmael, even though he was younger. God blessed Jacob instead of Esau, even though he was younger. And now God wanted Jacob to bless Ephraim instead of Manasseh, even though he was younger. The pattern was to show that God's future promises are done by his sovereign choice rather than what was expected. Now, I want to highlight that everything Jacob said in his blessing to Joseph's sons assumes that his descendants will eventually leave Egypt. Why do I say that? Joseph's sons were citizens of Egypt, and Joseph was a high-ranking official in Egypt, which means they would always be identified as Joseph's sons in Egypt. But by identifying Joseph's sons as descendants of Abraham, they would need to eventually leave Egypt. And in case you think I'm reading into his blessing, previously we see that Jacob told Joseph to promise not to bury him in Egypt, but in a cave that Abraham bought in the promised land. Also, notice that the author of Hebrews says that Jacob was holding his staff while blessing Joseph's sons. Only people who traveled carried this staff. Jacob didn't stop holding a staff in Egypt because he knew he was in a foreign land. Even as he was dying, Jacob worshiped God, leaning on the pilgrim staff, revealing his acknowledgement that he was a stranger stranger in Egypt, waiting for God's promises to be fulfilled, which included their return to the promised land. Finally, let's look at if Joseph also exemplified this type of faith. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Now, we know that Joseph was very patient and endured many trials. His brothers sold him as a slave, and he was falsely imprisoned in Egypt. So you would think that the author of Hebrews will highlight one of those moments in Joseph's life, but instead, it is his deathbed confession the author wants to highlight. And what sticks out is that Joseph made his descendants promise that they will carry his bones out of Egypt. Even though he married an Egyptian woman, had Egyptian sons, and was a high-ranking Egyptian, he never saw Egypt as his home. Why? Because he knew that God promised Abraham that his descendants would possess Canaan, and whatever God promised, he believed will happen eventually. And the beautiful thing is that over 400 years later, when God delivered Israel from Egypt through the leadership of Moses, they remembered to bring Joseph's bones with them. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from there. Then when Moses wasn't allowed to enter the promised land, we see that Joshua remembers to bring Joseph's bones. As for the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem in the piece of land that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. It became an inheritance of the descendants of Joseph. From Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, what we have learned is that faith looks beyond death and continues to hold to God's promises for us, even if we don't see any evidence for it. Why? Because whatever God has promised will eventually happen. If you want to study more about Hebrews chapter 11, I'll leave a link in the description box below to a recommended resource. If you missed the last video about the faith of Abraham in sacrificing Isaac, I'll leave a link here for you to watch. Until next time, see you!